All right, I'm back for a plenary session, and I'm talking with a few people who have been people I've exchanged messages with or have been on the show before in the case of Tracy Beth. So, first, we have Tracy Beth Hogue, who is joining us from the border of Nevada and California. She's, of course, an MD, PhD in epidemiology. She has done so many important papers and work throughout this pandemic, including been a part of several school studies, been a part of investigations of myocarditis, and we're going to talk about some of that. We have Allie Krug, who's joining us from the East Coast, and she's also a public health expert and epidemiologist by training, who has worked on a number of papers that have generated considerable interest, and we'll talk about some of that. And I'm joined by Robert Pizzini, who's joining us from Virginia Beach, and he has an interest in one of the papers we're going to be talking about today, which is youth ice hockey and making that run safely. So thank you all for joining me. Let me start with you, Tracy. Um, I wanted to ask you, um, you've been out there for quite some time now, and you've been pushing on a number of important issues. And I wanted to talk about one of those issues real quick before we jump into the youth ice hockey paper, and it is your myocarditis preprint. Um, I saw recently that, am I correct in thinking that this was cited by some podcasters in a long form discussion recently? This estimate, and it it basically is an analysis of the VAERS database, looking at myocarditis, particularly looking at a risk at an age group that we hadn't looked at before, 12 to 15, specifically boys, and you found roughly a adjudicated incidence of 1 in 6,800. And I say adjudicated because John Mandrola, the cardiologist, adjudicated that. Um, and what I found very interesting is in maybe 2 weeks after your preprint and all the brouhaha about it, the New England Journal has a paper out from the Israelis about rates of myocarditis from the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine in a slightly higher age group, 16 to 19. But I found it to be 1 in 7,100 or something like that, 7,100, 7,200, pretty close to what you all found. So I wonder, maybe we'll start with Tracy and then go to Allie real quick. I'm curious. I don't know. How do you feel about? Oh, the last thing I'd say, there's another preprint which was by the investigators in Ottawa, and I think all three of us were on some chain of messages where we mentioned it, and we were all a little bit concerned that it was a bit more frequent than any other estimate out there, and so we all kind of refrained from amplifying it, and that has since been brought down because it was 1 in 1,000, which is a little more common than what we had been seeing. So I guess I'm wondering, from your point of view, how did you feel about, I don't know, your paper, the feedback? What did it make you think, Tracy?
Yeah, I mean, I thought that the methods in our paper were good, and I felt like our estimate was probably an underestimate, rather than an overestimate. And before we released it as a preprint, there was data from the FDA that actually showed a 1 in 5,000 rate, from Pfizer, and so I kind of thought, well, if we released data from our VAERS search that shows 1 in 6,200, for the 12 to 15-year-olds and 1 in 10,600 for the 16 to 17-year-olds, like we're probably not presenting an overestimate.
Right.
And so then after the Israeli data came out in the New England Journal, and also the data from Ontario, it's more and more looking like, as you said, like our estimate was in the range of other estimates, international estimates. And so, I understand about the hesitation of using VAERS, but I think you've mentioned it before that, we had John Mandrola, cardiologist, adjudicate all the cases. And, we excluded a large number of cases that, were on the border that could have been included, but didn't have quite enough objective
I
criteria.
see.
And I think the hesitation or a lot of the critique of our paper has been comparing our rates of post-vaccination myocarditis to the 120-day hospitalization risk, for boys with and without medical
Sure. Okay.
comorbidities. And so I understand that critique, and basically we decided to use that because the CDC had also used that. The 120-day hospitalization comparison. The difference between ours and theirs is we looked at boys with and without medical comorbidities, which really hadn't been done before, because we know there's a large difference in hospitalization risk between those two groups. And what our paper was really trying to do is try to identify, is there a group that could possibly be closer to, being on the borderline in terms of, is there potentially more harm than good? Like, is it even close? I mean, we still don't have the answer, I think, to that question, because we still actually don't have a really good estimate of the prevalence of COVID myocarditis in the 12 to 17-year-old boys. And so there's still a lot of questions, but our paper was just one among many that have presented initial data that I think are really important to keep in mind when we're just looking at the overall well-being. What's the best thing to do for boys, especially when many boys have pre-existing immunity? There's the option of giving one dose. There's the option of giving a lower dose.
Right.
So, I think I agree with many things that you've said, that it might be a mistake to really rush into it before figuring out how to minimize harm.
Right. And I guess the only other thing I'd add to what you said is the point that there is another preprint, or I think it had been published, that tried to compare risk of myocarditis from vaccination with risk of myocarditis from SARS-CoV-2. But that has and it claims that, the vaccine is much safer than the virus, but it has a catastrophic error, which is they have no idea what the denominator is with people.
Yeah, no, exactly. They had a catchment area of 60 million people,
Yes,
and it was over a year, and they had 6 cases of myocarditis in boys 12 to 17 over that entire time period. So I'm like, well, that sounds really, really low. But they didn't have they didn't define the denominator.
They didn't define the denominator.
It was
They didn't
hard
do a
to figure out how to
seroprevalence.
use it.
But my point isn't that I think these types of comparisons are always going to be very tricky. It's a very tricky thing to do. But I find it curious that people were critical of yours and while they trumpet the other one, which is the
yes, yeah. It's like you can
right?
always make mistakes in one direction, and people just look
Right.
away. But that's fine. I like being on the side of people being critical of what we're doing. But
as long as it's fair criticism, I'm happy to hear
yeah,
it.
no, that's right. That's right. I don't really
then
take the personal insults seriously, so they don't bother me.
That's good. You're very patient with people. Allie, then we're going to talk about youth hockey, but any thoughts on this issue? How did I see you very patiently replying to many people. The one thing about Twitter, I think I have to say this about, instead of in a real conversation, a conversation ends. But on Twitter, a conversation never ends, because you can be replying to something from 2 days ago, and then somebody replies to you, and they find a tweet you did 14 days ago, and they pick up in that moment of conversation. But I have other things to do, right? So I noticed you were in some conversations that went on for a week. So how did you find it? What did you think?
Well, I'm fairly new to Twitter. I really just became active this year in moving back to the States from Japan, and really wanted to be involved with all of you great minds out there, really wrestling with these big ideas and these big concerns about how do we do it right? How do we really consider all of the stakeholders around the table and be fair and be mindful and intentional when we develop policy? So I've really appreciated listening to you and so many others. And so I really appreciate the conversation on Twitter. I do find it very challenging because, unlike Tracy, I have little experience and I tend to take things very personally, and I really deeply care about getting it right. So I'm very honored to work with Tracy and watch her methods and learn from her and learn from so many others. I think what I would add to your conversation about Myo is that it's unfortunate that our paper was taken in such a, like a binary way. It was all or nothing. And really, that's not what we were saying at all. We closed our paper with, let's look abroad. Let's look at examples from elsewhere where we were actually thinking about, 1 dose versus 2 or natural immunity. And really people, positioned our paper, or some people did, others welcomed it and welcomed the conversation. But many of the most critical really took us the wrong way. And that made me very anxious because of my great concern for vaccination policy in this country. I'm very much pro-vaccine, and I really did not want people to have undue concern about maybe starting a series for a child who has comorbidities when it might be appropriate, having that conversation with their doctor. I did not want our paper to shut down conversation. I wanted it to start the conversation. And unfortunately for some, we were positioned in a place where we became anti-vax, which was a really strange place to be put, to be honest.
Yeah, I think I'm troubled with irrationality in both directions, and I think that you've tasted some irrationality on the other side, because I think it was a fair contribution. One of the other sort of disparaging things I heard was that some journals had reviewed it and rejected it, which is something that you didn't have to tell anybody, but you may happen to mention it. Well, that's the nature of a lot of papers. That's the reality. A lot of papers have been considered by some journals and rejected and go to other journals doesn't necessarily in and of itself is disqualifying. And I think at the end of the day, we'll see where history shakes out, but the estimate is squarely in the middle of other estimates. And so I just can't get too excited about an estimate squarely in the middle of other estimates. And I wouldn't dare call it biased in any particular direction. Okay, let's turn to you, Robert. What I want to know, you're muted, so unmute yourself while I'm saying the question. So I guess what I want to know from you, Robert, is hockey. For the person out there listening who says, is hockey so important? I wonder if you might explain, why does hockey matter to kids, and why is this the topic of your paper and what we're going to talk about and what's to come?
Sure. Well, there's two ways to answer that. Hockey is very important. Youth sports, generally speaking, are very important in a pre-COVID environment.
Yeah.
This is socialization. This is growth. This is maturity. This is children growing physically, mentally, and emotionally, and creating bonds. Some that last for the rest of their lives. Some of them, it gives very concrete direction to their lives. So it's very important, generally speaking. The hockey community is a very unique community among youth sports in that there's additional commitment. There's the cost of the equipment, there's the travel associated, there's the risk of the game, kids skating at 20 to 30 miles per hour. But what COVID has shown us is how important youth sports are. We were able to continue through Allie's hard work and through our COVID procedures that we put in place. We were able to continue almost uninterrupted with our hockey season. There were some short shutdowns to deal with certain aspects of COVID, but generally speaking, we were able to proceed.
And when did the season run, from when to when?
So it's a 26-week season, basically.
That's a long season.
Yeah, basically
half a year.
Half a year. So it's and believe me, as a coach, I love it when it starts, but I love it when it's over. But it's the 13 weeks before Christmas, little 2-week break for Christmas, and then the 13 weeks after is the way the season runs.
Let me ask you one more question here. So you made a good case of some of the benefits to kids from participating in organized sports activities. I might toss out one more and see what you think about this, which is that it's one of the few times in this modern world where somebody scores more points than someone else, and somebody wins and somebody loses, and that there's some people out there better than you. When I was coming up, I think you would get that reinforcement in school. You know what you're good at, you know what you're not good at. But increasingly, I think everyone gets praised for so many things. But sports is a great. There's no praise if praise is not due in sports. You really have to earn it. Do you feel like that's part of it too?
Well, it is with hockey. Now, I've seen other sports where everybody gets a trophy. There's been that evolution in youth sports, which is unfortunate, really, because life is much different than everybody gets a trophy. But one of the things we discovered through COVID and by keeping our hockey program intact is these kids, they weren't going to school, they weren't doing any other social activities, and they thrived on being around each other. And it was just so obvious to us at a certain point. And it was important to them. They were getting something through hockey, through the affiliation with their teammates that had largely been taken away from them in every other aspect of their lives.
Interesting.
So huge and significant and noteworthy, to say the least.
Tracy, I wonder if you might talk a little bit about what was the strategy? How were you, hockey, it sounds to me, and prima facie, people would think it might sound quite risky. I mean, it's cold. The air temperature's got to be cold. You've got, it's indoor. That air must be stagnant. You got kids there out on the ice for a prolonged period of time. And maybe when they're sitting on the bench, that seems like a confined area. I always see that them all walled in that little glass area. So, at first glance, it might seem like a dangerous thing to do. It's not, a bike race outside or something like that. So how did you approach it? How did you think about it? And how did you ultimately facilitate it? And then I'll come to you, Allie.
Yeah, so I have to say, Allie really designed the protocols of what to do.
You want to go in reverse order then? Let's go to you, Allie.
Yeah. I think, I'm happy to answer, but she'll do a better job.
Okay.
Oh, thanks, Tracy. I grabbed Tracy because she has experience in schools in this environment. And so that's why we collaborated on this study. But yeah, we approached the season knowing that there was some risk. CDC had already published a study on recreational and adult league outbreak. But when I was reading it and moving back from Japan to the US in September and meeting this new team and becoming a part of the community, I was apprehensive about it myself, because I'm thinking, gosh, we're in the pandemic. I know that there's a surge coming. It's winter coming, this indoor, it's cold, and everybody's talking about ice is the highest risk indoor sport you could play. Because of all those factors. And there was a Yale study about, the Zamboni and, layers of air and stagnant air right at face level and things like that. So I went in with eyes wide open. I did research on, news articles about outbreaks in other rinks. I knew about some in Massachusetts. And I also looked at the USA hockey protocols and figured, well, it's a good start. We'll observe, we'll see how we're doing. And then if we detect any cases, then we'll need to have a real COVID response team come together and evaluate our remaining vulnerabilities. I already had kind of a working list in my mind of what they were, probably lobbies, locker rooms, and lines from observing. That's where I thought the congestion would be. And we did have an outbreak, and that's what really precipitated our collaboration together with hockey director Rich, who sadly couldn't be here today. He had a flight change, and Bob. So we brought together the leadership of the rink, and we brought together the team managers and the parents, and really looked at where the transmission might be occurring in densely packed areas where masks were off right after practice. Kids are excited, they're ungearing and things like that. We were not using locker rooms, but they were using the lobby still. So then, just to move this conversation on, I could talk forever about what we did, but we basically said, any congested area is going to be conducive to transmission. So we have to just move everybody outside. All of the talking, all of the typical hanging out, all of that bonding that you see with youth sports, that all had to happen outside. So we set up 2 outdoor locker rooms.
I see.
And kids arrived fully geared up, skates on, sticks in hand, water bottles in hand, straight to the ice. Practice straight off the ice. And then we increased the interval of time between games and practices to flush the parents in and out so that they weren't hanging out inside talking. So all of
explain that part again. What is this interval of time business? Explain that.
We changed the timing of the game so that we could actually get 15 minutes between practice sessions or games instead of just 5 minutes.
And did you ventilate the place with like fans and stuff while you did it? Or?
Actually, no. The ice rink itself is huge. The lobby was my big concern, because the lobby was a smaller area and lower ceiling. But really, we just wanted to move parents out. And so if the kids were going directly out and not hanging out in the lobby, guess where the parents go? They follow the kids out to the car. And so any socialization was naturally just going to happen out at the car. The big change that we made that people didn't understand and were a little irritated about is I said no hockey bags in the lobby. And the reason I said no hockey bags in the lobby, people thought maybe I considered hockey bags to be a vector for transmission, but really it was just a vector for conversation. If the hockey bag comes in, then the skates come off, the skates go in the bag, the gear goes in the bag, and people don't clear out. And so that was one of those.
Or talk.
Right. That was just
hockey bags are heavy bags. Is that fair to say? They're like big and bulky and 50, 60 pounds.
They are heavy, but there's really interesting innovation that happens. Where there's a need, there's a way. They actually have like little skate guards with wheels on them, so the kids could actually sort of skate from the car into the rink.
Oh, really?
It's like little sort of rollerblade skate guards. So yeah, I see. Innovation.
I'm pulled up your paper here. It's called Youth Ice Hockey COVID-19 Protocols and Prevention of Sport-Related Transmission. It's in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. It was issued initially in August of this year. And here's what you write. You write, following an outbreak of SARS-CoV-2 in November 2020, you had a response team evaluate the dynamics of transmission. And that's when you put into place these protocols. And I guess the insight is that you felt like the time on the ice, that's not the vulnerable moment. It was all the time before you went out there, when you were taking breaks, et cetera. And you did your best to minimize those encounters. Tracy, what are your thoughts? What would you add to this?
Yeah, so I think it was essentially, we limited the amount of adults that were in the building, and we limited the amount of time indoors for the kids. And then the time indoors, we focused on symptom screening, and so being aware of mild symptoms among the kids to get tested. And then we had been aware from previous studies, like a really good study in the British Journal of Sports Medicine of rugby, even in adults, that as long as they were asymptomatic, there was actually no transmission, even among players found to be infected, to people they had tackled. So they had done like video study of rugby matches in the UK and found that. So now that was outdoors. And then we knew from outdoor soccer, of youth soccer over the summer of 2020, that there were 90,000 kids and there was only one transmission event linked to it. And we knew, from school studies that kids were lower risk of transmission, especially if they're asymptomatic. And so that's what we found with the protocol. We didn't know if there would be transmission, but we found out that there were even kids who had come onto the ice that were later found to be infected that didn't transmit it further, and they weren't masked. So, this is not a randomized control trial.
No.
So, I mean, that's an obvious limitation of our study, but
it's a
to
QI
me, it
project of sorts,
was a community of people coming together, prioritizing doing the right thing for these kids and getting them out back onto the ice, doing what they loved, and then kind of like modifying things as things progressed. If there was if there was an outbreak related to it. And it sounds like the outbreak was eventually tracked back to a picture night that was probably from an adult who I understand was actually masked, but Allie gave me the details on that. But
I read about Marin County too. So.
What's that?
No, it reminded me of Marin County. Of course, the teacher was masked all day and very sick, but it must have spread when she took it off to read the book. Okay,
she must have.
That must have been the moment, right? So,
off,
Robert, question for you, which is, of all the parts of the protocol, which did you find the most difficult, the most challenging to actually kind of implement? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. So
okay.
My building has a tendency to make noise from time to time, and it's a background noise, so I keep muting. So early in the protocols, we did experiment with the kids wearing masks while they were skating. We tried several different methods. Bauer and CCM and some of the major hockey equipment manufacturers came up with devices as well. And we just never found anything that worked well. So that was frustrating for.
In what way? The exercise tolerance of the athlete, or what was it? What was it that didn't work well? It fogged up the visor?
Creating fog for those who had visors was one issue, or kids who wear glasses was another issue, or the restriction. Being able to see. The restriction in breathing was an issue. And even during coaching, so as a coach, I had to wear a mask on the ice and on the bench, and it made coaching much more difficult. Keep in mind, as a coach, you work a whistle. As a referee, there's a whistle involved, and so when we were masked up early on, it just made the process that much more difficult. And of course, that slows the learning process, and it can be frustrating in certain cases. So those were some of the early frustrations that we ran into.
We tried to address that by, when we realized that was a problem, we actually standardized all of our drills to just a core set of like 4 to 6, so that the kids weren't having to learn drills while they're on the ice. Because we also took back 5 minutes from the ice time. Parents are real sensitive to ice time. They don't want to lose the ice time. So we really tried to get everybody into just, these are the core standard drills you're going to do. This is what we're going to do every time. So there's less talking, less huddling and clustering around the coach, which is a time when kids could transmit to each other too.
I guess what I find interesting about this is, and the point's well taken, it's not a randomized trial, but to do a really good randomized trial, I think you'd need, it'd have to be super big, because you'd want to kind of randomize all these different parts of the puzzle to see which ones make a difference and which ones, may not have made a difference. But what I think is interesting is that, I don't think of it in that way. It's really more of a QI project that, like many single centers initiate in medicine for whatever purpose. But what I think is really kind of ambitious about it was that it is potentially, what people would have thought would be the highest risk sporting activity. Meanwhile, here in California, I was driving around and I saw some people playing soccer outside in the California summer with an 80% vaccination rate among adults, and all the kids were wearing masks outside in the sun. So, I thought to myself, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But what you all were able to achieve is pre-vaccine in the winter, no mask for the activity itself. And I guess more than anything, I think the thing that jumped out at me was that, it took something, and maybe Allie, I'll have you comment on this. It took some type of, I don't know what's the right word, ambition to even try to do such a thing. The safe thing, the easy thing would have been to not even attempt it. And I think that's what many places chose to do, not even attempt it. What made you, what pushed you to try?
Well, that's a good question, Vinay, and it's something that you deal with a lot, and I think we're all grappling with, which is risk assessment, right, and risk tolerance. And the fact was the program was going to continue. It's a nonprofit program, 200 families, And I actually looked at it from not the perspective of just the kids, but also the families benefiting as a unit from some routine. And I just was thinking about the mental health aspects as well of parents staying in normal routines. So knowing that this was going to continue, I felt like the right thing to do would be to invest my very best knowledge and
I see.
research.
You're saying you joined an organization that was already kind of committed to going forward with hockey.
Yes, but when we hit, I think that they were planning on going through the season, but what really struck me as impressive is hockey director Rich's ability to pivot very quickly from, we're going forward and we have all these restrictions in place to, oh my goodness, we have an outbreak on our hands. Now I really see how easily this can transmit. Just a full appreciation among all the parents of just how easily COVID can pass and how honestly, how minor the symptoms are in kids. That was the thing that really surprised everybody, is it looked like the common cold. It did not look like the CDC's list of symptoms. So that huge awareness on the part of parents allowed us to all work together and cooperate a little bit more. But, hockey people have maybe a different risk tolerance than perhaps some others. And I will admit
the mere fact they're playing hockey, huh?
I'm fairly risk averse. I chose not to go into medicine and chose to be an epidemiologist because I can look at data and population-based data from my computer. I just am not the most courageous of souls out there, perhaps, or I'm very calculating in my risks. But they were planning to go ahead. But honestly, Vinay, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about today is this continues. This risk assessment continues, and it's the path forward out of the pandemic back into this awkward transition time that we're in. I mean, we're back in another hockey season. We do have cases that pop up, and we have to decide, are we going forward with games this weekend or not, for instance, and how do we do that? And we have a different landscape now. We have our most vulnerable vaccinated. We have teens vaccinated. We have younger kids who are least risk, but they're unvaccinated. And so it's really a conversation that continues with the parents about just how much risk can you tolerate? Let's inform them about, hey, there was one exposure in the opposing team. We can rapid test everybody. We can quarantine that one child, but should we allow the teens to come and play briefly and just not hang out in the rinks? So these sorts of ongoing risk assessments are really time consuming, but I think they're very important to have an open conversation about this, because lots of areas are not able to do this. We're just in this constant, zero risk tolerance mode. And then there's other places who are grappling with it in a very open way. And I just wanted to allow others to kind of hear what we're doing and what we're trying to do. We're not perfect at all, but we are trying to work together as a community. And my naive vision is that this can serve as like a petri dish. Maybe that's a bad analogy, but for other communities trying to do this difficult work as well.
I just want to say one thing about risk, and then I'll let Tracy chime in. The thing I wanted to say about risk is your point's well taken, that I think different people have a different threshold of risk, and it's not up to any one person to tell someone else what risks they should or should not accept. But one thing that strikes me throughout this pandemic has always been when you see somebody making kind of irrational choices. And the example I always use is I drive around the city and I see a lot of people putting young kids on these new kind of canoe bicycles and biking around the city. That's a very risky thing to do, because people are driving, they're looking at their phone, and one split second a car's going to hit the bike. And many years ago when I was in college, I was actually hit by a car. So I have a taste of what that's like. It's a very unpleasant thing. And if a car is moving at a certain clip, it's a catastrophic event. So that's a risk. And when you put your kid in a bicycle and bike the kid somewhere, it's a risk. It has a certain risk mile for mile and a certain risk minute for minute. And then I also see perhaps sometimes the same people, they want their kid to wear the mask outdoors or something like that. Well, there's some risk there too. And wearing the mask might mitigate it. I don't know. Maybe it doesn't mitigate it at all. But I start to think about those two different risks. And in my mind, one is a much bigger risk that they're accepting, and the other risk is a very, very small risk. And that to me is irrational. Tracy, what was your thoughts on this risk question?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to bring up the fact that there are many types of risks to children. And I think a lot of parents right away figured out that there is a huge risk to disrupting normalcy in a child's life, and taking away sports in school comes at a huge cost. And as soon as a parent realizes the risk to their child from COVID and the risks that they're like visualizing, like seeing right before their very eyes of their children becoming depressed and disconnected from their peers and gaining weight and not being able to go to sports, and it immediately you see how big the other risks are, like the trade-offs. And I think that, this piece was really important because, like you said, it took sort of like the highest risk sport, or at least that it has the reputation of being that in terms of COVID spread. And we kind of demonstrated, where there's a will, there's a way. If you want to keep it going, there's a way to do it. There's a way to keep kids happy, and keep them, provide them a sense of normalcy in their normal lives. And so I just think throughout this pandemic, we've failed to talk about risk in the terms of what are the other risks to kids, like what are they missing out on?
Right.
And
even
so
ourselves,
I know
even
our
adults
paper,
too.
What's that?
I mean, everybody, I guess one point I want to make about this is that someone who might contend that, yes, kids are anxious and all these things are going on with kids' mental health, but they'll say something like, most of that is attributable to the casualties of the pandemic. And I want to say that there might be some truth in that. Many of us have lost a loved one, an uncle, an aunt, a grandparent. Some kids have lost a parent as well. That's very tragic, and of course is going to scar those children. But there's an additional way in which anxiety is provoked, perhaps in a much larger number of children, and that is that their day-to-day lives are completely disrupted. And it's very difficult, I think, for a young person, or especially a teenager, especially a young college person, to have their entire life sort of radically transformed for risks that they may in other ways in their life accept those levels of risk. And so I think to some degree, this will be parsed out in years to come, how much of the anxiety was due to one or the other. But I don't discount lack of normalcy as a huge driver of anxiety. Okay,
Yeah, no, I mean,
Yeah,
and listening to the Danish news,
Yes.
they're always talking about the importance of routines in childhood. And that's just something that I never hear talked about in the United States. Like, I don't hear that side of the story about like what are the downsides of what we're doing to kids.
Well, you and I both know that, like, if you look at all pandemic guidance pre-2010, it would all say that good pandemic mitigation is the least disruptive to the normal functioning of a society. And a lot of those guidances have been completely thrown in the trash. Okay, I'll give you all the last word. We'll start with Robert, then we'll go to Allie, then we'll go to Tracy. So, Robert, any last thoughts on this? It's a very interesting paper. People should check it out. You have a nice table in terms of what were the enhanced protocols you did. And I think it is what it is. It is a single uncontrolled study, but it does have a result that appears to be quite good. Robert?
Yeah, so I'll just pick up where Tracy left off. The voices are there. The concern is there regarding children's routines being disrupted. But unfortunately, at least in the US, those voices are almost being drowned out by opposition, by people who are so risk adverse that they're not willing to consider the damage that's being done. At least that's kind of the way I see the argument or the landscape. And then I'll just close with, I feel somewhat unprepared for this discussion because Allie has hockey sticks in the background, and I'm the hockey coach, and I don't have hockey sticks or a hockey puck or anything right here I can show you. So thank you.
No, thank you so much. And I think you make a good point that I think a lot of people feel as if that other voices have drowned out sort of different perspectives, maybe middle ground perspectives a lot of the time. Allie, your thoughts?
Yeah, it's just the collaboration and community, and the great privilege of working together with people who have different perspectives than me, and different realities on the ground, and working together with the parents, the people whose lives were directly impacted, made our protocols stronger. And I just came away with that. And you and Stefan have talked about the importance of really including the people whose policies will actually, the policies that the leadership implements, involving the people whose lives are directly affected is so vitally important to ensuring sustainability and collaboration. And that was just a great privilege for me. And I'm so thankful for Tracy joining in this effort.
Tracy, your last thoughts?
Oh yeah, no, it was such an honor to be part of the study. And I just think we need more research like this. We need more discussions about the trade-offs of what we're doing, especially when it comes to the most vulnerable in our population. And so I just want to applaud all of you and the scientists and physicians who are willing to sort of stand up for it when they see something that that isn't necessarily on the side of we need to do more to prevent COVID, but maybe there are downsides to what we're doing, because can be a scary time right now to speak up for that. But I just want to thank everyone who has been willing to do that. So
that's kind of you to say. I guess I guess I feel compelled to say one last thing, if you don't mind. I guess the only thing I would say is like the more I have ruminated about this issue, I think maybe like the way we should think about all these kinds of policies is I put them in three buckets. Okay, one bucket, they're the things you do that actually like lower your risk of having bad COVID outcomes, like when you meet the virus, and like for adults, that's like getting vaccinated. Maybe it's also like, if we could lose weight and improve our general cardiovascular and physical health, that might help too, but that has largely been unstudied. The next bucket are like the things you do that might delay the time until you meet SARS-CoV-2. And it is quite plausible that some of the things you implement in your protocol were in that bucket. And that's why that it didn't spread when you were going forward with your sports. The third bucket are things we did that didn't really matter, that made us feel like we did something, but they didn't do anything. And there may even be some of those things in your protocol, because we didn't tease out every component, but certainly some of those things like outdoor masking or like, preventing kids from playing soccer outside or playing on the swing set, or taking swings off playgrounds, those were clearly in that bucket. And I guess the next 10 years will be, I think, people trying to sort these things out and figure out like what we did that mattered and what we did that didn't matter. And I guess the thing I applaud you all for the most was, I think it took some courage to even try to do what you did. And a lot of people would be unhappy with you even for attempting it. And yet you did it. So thanks for doing it. And it's been a pleasure to talk to you. And I'll post a link to the paper below.